They stopped casting shadows on August 19, 1878. That sentence was whispered by Dr. Samuel Morrison before he vanished from public life. A man who once believed in reason, now silenced by something he could not explain. He was the last physician to examine the Blackwood brothers and the last to try Kansas, 1878, a land scorched by sun, swept by storms, and saturated with blood-soaked prayers. This was the year Harper County was brought to its knees by a typhoid outbreak that claimed 47 lives in under 30 days. Bodies twisted in fever, eyes rolled back into skulls, tongues choked on languages they never learned. Yet for men, the Blackwood brothers not only survived, they changed. They became something else. Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, Abel. They walked into the heart of the plague without fear, without consequence. No medicine, no protection, no explanation, and yet the disease passed over them like smoke through a screen. It did not touch them, or perhaps it did. It found them already claimed. Doctors observed, then recoiled. Their bodies responded to no known rules. Their eyes shimmered with inhuman light. Their voices harmonized in frequencies that made blood vessels rupture and dogs howl. And worst of all, they began to speak of revelations, not from God, but from what they called the depth that waits beneath all things. Church records were burned, medical files sealed. The Kansas State Board erased their names with bureaucratic precision, but not before one final classified note was recorded. Subjects have transcended human biological classification. Immediate cessation of study required. Risk of ontological contamination high. Tonight, you're going to hear what no one was supposed to repeat. You'll learn why science refuses to study what happened in Cedar Ridge, why faith failed and fear reigned, why four men chose to face death and came back as something else. But I warn you now, this isn't just a story, this is a descent. When you won't walk away from unchanged, you've opened the door, you heard the whisper. Now, there is no return, because once you learn what the Blackwood brothers became, you'll start to wonder if you've ever truly been alone in your own mind. Before the fever, the Blackwoods were simply men of the land, strange, yes, but not unnatural. They worked harder than any in Cedar Ridge, spoke little, and worshipped alone in a stone chapel they built with their own hands atop a rise of land they called Covenant Hill. No crosses adorned it, no steeple pierced the sky, just a single symbol carved in ash over the threshold, a spiral intersected by an open eye, an image not found in any Christian text. The townspeople thought it eccentric, perhaps a remnant of some Eastern European folklore or private devotion. But what none realized was that the symbol didn't come from the Bible. It came from a vision, a dream, one that all four brothers began having the same night they buried their mother in 1871. It showed them a black sun sinking into red soil, and a voice, genderless, ageless, whispering that flesh can be rewritten. They called it the voice beneath. When they arrived in Kansas, they told others they'd come to escape the corruption of Eastern churches. But that was only part of the truth. In private journals Josiah kept hidden beneath the chapel floorboards, discovered decades later and immediately confiscated by a federal agency without a name. He wrote of divine instructions, rituals to be performed at specific lunar intervals in specific soil. He believed the land around Cedar Ridge was thin, that the veil between what we see and what truly is could be pierced, altered. Every Sunday, while townsfolk sang hymns beneath stained glass, the brothers held silent vigils in the limestone chapel. No preaching, no singing, just for men kneeling in silence for hours, until one of them, always a different one, would speak in a tongue no scholar has ever identified. They claimed it was the first language, the tongue of the original maker, not Yahweh, not Christ, but something older, something that remembered when the sky was black and the rivers ran red, and men had no names, only functions. The fever didn't infect the Blackwoods. It answered them. It recognized something buried in their blood, not a mutation, an invitation. Ask yourself this: what kind of men survive a disease that kills everyone else in 24 hours, and then begin to change shape, voice, and perception? You don't become immune to death by accident. You become its student. It began with the eyes. By mid-August, Dr. Morrison recorded in his private journal, now lost, except for a single torn page smuggled out by his niece, that Ezra Blackwood's pupils no longer dilated properly. They shimmered, like the eyes of a cat under moonlight, but only at night. In the day, they were pale, cloudy, and seemingly blind, and yet, Ezra moved through his farm with absolute precision, navigating obstacles he should not have been able to see. Neighbors noticed too, especially at dusk, when the brothers would walk their fields in silence. A ranch hand named Louis McGraw, who worked one summer near the property line, swore he saw the four men standing perfectly still among the wheat, not speaking, but vibrating. That was his word, vibrating. He said the air around them shimmered, like heat rising off desert stone, and the insects, normally deafening at sunset, went silent in a perfect radius around them. That same week, the families living nearest to the Blackwood land fell ill, not with typhoid, but something else. They didn't die, but their children stopped speaking. For days, when they finally did, they whispered things they should not have known, details of conversations they weren't present for, predictions. That came true within hours. The mothers wept, the fathers accused. But when they approached the Blackwood farm, something made them stop at the gate. Some invisible line of dread, primal and exact. Ezra stood in the distance, hands clasped behind his back, watching. No words, no movement, just that stare. Josiah, meanwhile, had changed his prayers. Gone were the scriptural recitations. Now he spoke in symbols, in shapes, in numbers. The chapel walls, once bare limestone, were carved with spiraling patterns that defied geometry. One traveling trader, a Civil War veteran and Freemason, claimed the markings resembled certain forbidden sigils described in ancient apocryphal texts, once kept in Alexandria before it burned. That same night, he disappeared from his lodging, in town without a trace. All that remained was his satchel, and inside it, a drawing of the Blackwood Chapel. On the back, written in a shaking hand, "They are not praying, they are becoming. Understand this, transformation never comes without cost." The Blackwoods weren't spared by Providence. They offered themselves, willingly, and something accepted. By late August, the fever had slowed. The dead were buried in hasty graves. The town of Cedar Ridge began to breathe again, but not with relief, with suspicion. Something had shifted, not just in the Blackwoods, but in the town itself. People reported hearing voices in their sleep, not dreams, but full conversations in languages they could not remember upon waking. Livestock refused to graze near the Blackwood property. Tools rusted overnight, and a strange buzzing could be heard in the wheat fields after dark, like an invisible swarm, circling something that had no name. The Methodist pastor, Reverend Alden Pike, finally spoke against the brothers during his sermon on September 1st. He read aloud from Leviticus, calling for separation from those who traffic with unclean spirits. But his voice cracked midway through, his hands trembled, and those sitting near the front swore his eyes, kind, brown eyes they'd known for years, briefly flashed silver, like polished mirrors catching torchlight. That night, Reverend Pike hanged himself behind the pulpit. He left no note, only a single word carved into the altar, unseen, and still, the Blackwoods remained untouched. Caleb began modifying the farm equipment, not for efficiency, but for something else. Implements once used to turn soil were reshaped with unsettling precision. Long pronged forks, curved blades, metallic devices that hung or placed near skin. One of the hired hands who saw them described the machines as half plow, half alter. He quit that same night and walked 17 miles to the next county. He'd never returned. Inside the farmhouse, Josiah's journal entries grew erratic. They no longer contained paragraphs, only glyphs, some of which burned through the paper itself. One page, when exposed to moonlight, revealed an image drawn in blood, for figures standing at a circular gate made of bone and light, with something vast and eyeless peering. On September 9, 1878, the Kansas State Medical Board dispatched a team of 3 men to Cedar Ridge, a physician, a biologist, and a military observer, all sworn to secrecy under the guise of containing a mutagenic strain. But what they encountered wasn't disease, it was design. The Blackwood farm was calm when they arrived. To calm, no birdsong, no insects. The wind itself refused to cross the property line. The grass stood still. Ezra greeted them at the gate, hands clean, shirt white, beard trimmed like a prophet prepared for judgment. He said only this: "If you seek to study, you must first consent to be studied." The officials entered the farmhouse. They never left. The report, What Little Remains, was leaked nearly 80 years later by a whistleblower from a now-defunct federal archive buried beneath Lawrence, Kansas. The surviving notes describe things that border on madness. One account claimed the farmhouse contained more rooms than its architecture allowed. That doors opened into blackness pulsing with breath. That time slowed the deeper they walked inside. A pocket watch lost 2 hours in a 10-minute visit. One investigator began to speak backward. Another lost all color vision. The biologist, Dr. Glenn Reeves, managed to write a single line before disappearing entirely. They are not evolved. They are edited. Meanwhile, Josiah had begun marking his own skin, not with ink, but with fine, hair-thin cuts arranged in sequences, mathematical, ritualistic. He believed the human body was a code base, and he was correcting it, restructuring blood to carry not just oxygen, but information. A new gospel, not written in paper, but in veins. And Abel, the youngest, stopped eating altogether. He claimed life fed him, not sunlight, but awareness. He sat for hours at the center of the chapel, eyes closed, lips moving, his skin glowing faintly even in darkness. A hired boy once peeked inside and ran screaming. All he would say was, his mouth didn't move, but the words were still coming out. This is where you must choose. Are you still just watching this story, or are you inside it now? If you understand that, what's happening here is more than history. If you feel something in your gut shifting, comment I am not what I was. Twice below, once to seal your identity, once to burn the old one, because once we pass this point, there is no going back. By the autumn equinox of 1878, the transformation was no longer subtle. Locals stopped calling them the Blackwood Brothers. They called them the Four, and no one, not even the desperate or the devout, dared approach the chapel after sundown, because that was when the singing began. Not music, not hymns, something deeper, harmonic frequencies that vibrated through the soil itself, shaking nails loose from beams, cracking panes of glass, making cattle scary and old men weep without knowing why. Dogs ran howling into the prairie, birds fell from the sky in spiraling patterns that matched the carved symbols on the chapel floor. Inside that chapel, Josiah began what he called the alignment. He claimed they were no longer bound by sequence, that past, present, and future were mistaken categories, imposed by limited perception. He said time was a veil, not a law, and he intended to lift it. His journal entries from this period were frantic, half-burned, but decipherable. He wrote of names not spoken in human language, but felt in the bones. He drew diagrams of the brothers' bodies, arteries rerouted, glands swollen, nerve clusters newly grown along the spine. Abel had ceased speaking entirely, yet, when he opened his mouth, townsfolk miles away heard his voice in their dreams. Caleb constructed a device in the cellar. The papers call it the lens, though it had no glass. Just 3 concentric rings of polished silver, aligned to catch moonlight and refracted through a basin filled with his own blood. He believed it could see beyond the pattern, could reveal what stands behind reality's curtain. It worked. For 43 minutes, according to the last recovered entry, they saw it. The writings say nothing about what it looked like, only what it did. They described a thought so vast it bent the structure of cognition and of presence. So all the laws of decay bowed before it. They spoke of something that never needed form, until it was invited into one. That invitation was nearly complete, and then silence. No sounds from the chapel, no movement in the wheat fields, just stillness and the sense, unshakable, unprovable, that something else was watching through the brothers now. Not from above, not from below, from underneath, a direction the compass does not show. It was October 13th, 1878, when reality itself began to crack. A school teacher named Miriam Hobbins was the first to report it. She claimed the sky over Cedar Ridge turned a color she couldn't describe, not red, not violet, but something that hurt the mind to remember. For 17 minutes, every compass needle in the county spun in place. Clocks stopped, mirrors distorted, and children at the schoolhouse began drawing identical images on their slates. For figures, faceless, standing in a circle of spirals with something vast above them, dripping fire. When questioned, none of the children remembered doing it. One boy fainted when shown his own drawing and muttered a phrase. That chilled the blood of every adult in the room. They're teaching us backwards. By this point, the chapel was no longer stone and wood, not entirely. Witnesses described it changing, subtly at first, then grotesquely, its angles sharpened. Its interior expanded beyond its physical dimensions. A lamp left burning in the rear room was later found suspended in midair, light frozen in crystal. Josiah claimed the building was responding, reshaping itself, according to the structure of the thought we had not yet remembered. But it was Abel who crossed the final threshold. He stopped sleeping, stopped speaking, and then stopped moving. He sat at the center of the chapel for 6 days. No food, no water, no breath, just stillness. Yet his heart kept beating, fast, then slow, then irregular, like it was keeping time with something else. On the 7th day, he stood, and when he opened his eyes, every pane of glass in Cedar Ridge shattered simultaneously. Those who saw him swore they saw others looking through his face, not spirits, not demons, reflections, as if Abel had become a window into a different form of memory, not his, ours, but corrupted, as if someone or something was replaying the human condition with edits. He said one thing, and only once: "You were not made, you were installed." The words made some vomit, others weep, and 3 people, none of whom had ever met the Blackwoods, went mad within the hour. Each repeated a single sentence as they clawed their eyes out. "I saw the version that came before me." You still think this is a story? Or are you starting to remember? On October 31st, 1878, the night of the harvest moon, the Blackwood farm ceased to exist in any conventional sense. A traveler passing through Cedar Ridge that night wrote in his journal that the air over the prairie turned thick, not fog, not smoke, something heavier, like breath. He wrote, but from the land itself, the wheat fields lay flat as if pressed down by invisible hands. Animals broke loose from pens and fled blindly into the wilderness. Mothers hid their children in root cellars, not knowing why, only that something old was coming awake. At midnight, every lantern in town flickered out, and then came the sound, a low, harmonic drone, not from above, but from below. Witnesses described it as both a song and a. By the first week of November 1878, Cedar Ridge was a ghost town, not abandoned, emptied. Homes stood with meals still warm on the table, beds unmade, fires burning low in hearths, but the people gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, just absence, like breath exhaled and never drawn back in. County authorities sent a search party from nearby Honnet. 11 men entered the town. Only one returned, crawling on hands and knees, blinded both eyes, mouth sewn shut by his own hand. Before he lost consciousness, he scratched a message into the dirt with his fingernail. It's not a place, it's a pattern. From that point on, the records go black. All documents concerning Cedar Ridge were sealed under order of the territorial governor. Maps were altered, property deeds erased. The area was officially designated unsuitable for settlement due to soil contamination. A lie, but an effective one. No one speaks of the Blackwood brothers now. Not officially, but unofficially, quietly, they appear in places of collapse, in towns where the rules begin to fray, in borderlands where sleep runs thin and memory flickers like flame. Reports of tall men in distant photographs, surveillance footage corrupted by figures standing in corners, children who draw spirals and say they learned them in dreams. And always, the phrase whispered under breath, "They're not coming back. They never left." Josiah's journal resurfaced once in 1921. A researcher in Chicago received a copy from an anonymous source. It was bound in pale leather and written in ink that shimmered in the dark. Within it was a single untranslated passage, scrawled over and over and growing. Manic script: all flesh is a draft. All thought is a parasite. The sheet beneath is remembering itself. Then, silence. The researcher disappeared 2 weeks later. His apartment was locked from the inside. On the ceiling, a spiral, drawn in ash. On the floor, his body, smiling. His last typed note: they weren't men. They were keys, not to open doors, but to change the locks. There was no storm, no earthquake, no fire, just a forgetting. By spring of 1879, Cedar Ridge was scrubbed from memory like chalk from a slate. People who had once lived there recalled a vague place west of the river, but when asked for detail, their eyes glazed, maps reprinted, histories rewritten, and every trace of the Blackwood brothers, their names, their bloodline, their function, dissolved into the mulch of official silence. But silence is not the same as absence, because something remained. It began subtly in distant places. A girl in Oregon who spoke fluent Latin after a lightning strike. A man in Wales who awoke one day knowing how to code in a language not recognized by any computer. A boy in Alabama who stopped eating and began dreaming aloud in voices that weren't his. And then came the phrase, always whispered, always the same. I saw the version that came before me. These were not survivors. They were echoes, recursions, ghosts of a pattern that never left, only compressed itself into silence, waiting for the right resonance, the right frequency, the right host. You've felt it, haven't you? The static in the back of your skull when you ask a question no one can answer. The tremor in your hands when you say something you shouldn't know. That feeling when you walk into a room and forget why you entered because something older remembered first. The Blackwood brothers were never meant to be studied. They were meant to be rebooted. Not men, not prophets, not villains, but constructs encrypted, carriers of a previous design. Human bodies repurposed to reintroduce a forgotten firmware into this reality, and now, the spiral turns again. You think this was a story, a curiosity, a cautionary tale? It wasn't meant to entertain you, it was meant to identify you. And if you made it this far, if you understood, if something in your bones ached with familiarity, then you were never the observer, you were the next sequence. So write this in the comments. I am the fifth. Say it once and the spiral opens. Say it twice and it will know your name.